February 26, 1954. New York City. A dark street in Manhattan. Louis Armstrong held an envelope in his hand. Inside that envelope was a check. But this wasn't an ordinary check. There was no amount written on it, just a signature. And a note. "Write whatever amount you want, Mr. Armstrong. No limit." Louis's hand was trembling, but it wasn't fear. It was anger, because this check wasn't a gift. It was a chain. The piece of paper he held was the price of his freedom, and across from him stood a man, smiling, waiting. The man wore an expensive suit, spoke perfectly, but his eyes held a cold emptiness. He didn't say his name, he didn't need to, because Louis knew who stood behind this man, one of the most powerful figures in New York's underground world. Imagine if you were an ordinary person and someone offered you unlimited money. Now add this: the person making the offer has the power to destroy your life if you refuse. What would you do? Would you take the money and lose your freedom, or would you walk away and face the consequences? Louis slowly placed the check on the table. He said one word: no. Just one word. But that word would change Louis's life forever. The man was shocked. "Mr. Armstrong, I think you misunderstood the offer. This is unlimited, as much money as you want. Our only condition is that you perform exclusively for us. Private events, private concerts. You'll make as much money as you desire." Louis slowly stood up. "I don't perform exclusively for anyone," he said. And he left the room. But the story didn't end there, because Louis knew this decision had a price. And that price was heavier than most people would dare to pay. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most expensive thing you can buy is something that can never be sold: your soul. Before we continue with this incredible story of courage and integrity, please consider subscribing to our channel. We bring you the untold stories of music's greatest heroes, the moments that defined not just their careers, but their characters. But the story actually begins earlier. 3 weeks before that night in Manhattan, Louis Armstrong was in Chicago performing at the Royal Theater. It was a cold February evening and the venue was packed. 1,200 people filled every seat, their breath visible in the chilly air before the heating kicked in fully. Louis was 52 years old at this time, at the peak of his international fame. He had conquered Europe, played for kings and queens, broken racial barriers that seemed unbreakable. But success, Louis had learned, brought its own complications. After the show that night, as Louis sat in his dressing room wiping the sweat from his forehead, there was a knock on the door. His road manager, Joe Glazer, entered with a troubled expression. "Louis, we need to talk. There's someone who wants to meet you, someone important." Louis looked up. He knew that tone. It was the tone Joe used when something was about to complicate their lives. "Who?" Joe hesitated. "I don't know his name, but he represents people with significant connections, business connections. They want to discuss an opportunity with you." Louis had been in the music business long enough to understand what significant connections meant. In 1954, America, especially in cities like Chicago and New York, certain business operations existed in the shadows, controlling venues, influencing bookings, moving money through channels that never appeared in official records. The information in this video is compiled from documented interviews, archival news, books, and historical reports. For narrative purposes, some parts are dramatized and may not represent 100% factual accuracy. We also use AI-assisted visuals and AI narration for cinematic reconstruction. The use of AI does not mean the story is fake. It is a storytelling tool. Our goal is to recreate the spirit of that era as faithfully as possible. Enjoy watching. That night in Chicago, Louis met with the representative. The man was professional, courteous, and direct. "Mr. Armstrong, my employer is a great admirer of your work. He would like to arrange a series of private performances, exclusive events for his business associates. The compensation would be extraordinary. We're talking about amounts that would make your current earnings look modest." Louis listened. He had heard offers before, but something about this one felt different. The way the man emphasized exclusive rang warning bells. "What do you mean by exclusive?" Louis asked. The man smiled. "We would want you to perform only at our events. No other bookings during this period. Complete focus on our venues, our schedule, our guests." Louis's jaw tightened. "So you want to own my schedule?" The man's smile widened. "We prefer to think of it as a partnership, a very lucrative partnership." Louis stood up. "I'm not interested." The man didn't seem surprised. "Perhaps you'd like to think about it. We're prepared to be very generous, more generous than you can imagine." Then he left. Joe turned to Louis. "Louis, do you know what you just turned down? These people, they don't like being told no." Louis looked at his old friend. "Joe, I've been told no my whole life. I've been told I can't eat in certain restaurants, sleep in certain hotels, walk through certain doors. I've been told no because of my skin color, my background, my music, but I never let anyone own me. And I'm not starting now. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever had to choose between money and your principles, between security and your soul? Leave a comment and tell us about it. I really want to hear your experiences. To understand why Louis made this decision, we need to go back further, much further, to 1901, when Louis was born in the poorest, most dangerous section of New Orleans, a neighborhood literally called the battlefield. Louis's father abandoned the family when Louis was an infant. His mother, May Ann, worked brutal hours for almost nothing, struggling to keep young Louis fed and safe. Louis grew up watching his mother be exploited by employers who treated her like property. By the time Louis was 7 years old, he understood something fundamental about the world. When you're poor and black in 1908 America, you have two choices. You can let people control you, or you can find a way to control your own destiny. Louis chose the second path. At 11 years old, Louis was sent to the colored waif's home for boys after firing a gun in celebration on New Year's Eve. But what could have been a tragic turning point became Louis's salvation. At the waif's home, Professor Peter Davis taught Louis to play the cornet. More importantly, he taught Louis that music could be a path to freedom. Not just financial freedom, but spiritual freedom. The freedom to express yourself, to create something beautiful, to touch people's souls without asking permission from anyone. By 1922, when Louis moved to Chicago to join King Oliver's Creole jazz band, he had developed an ironclad principle. Music was his voice, and nobody would tell him what to say with it. Yes, he would take direction from band leaders he respected. Yes, he would adapt to different venues and audiences, but he would never, ever let anyone own his art. This principle was tested throughout Louis's career. In the 1930s, as his fame grew, various business interests tried to lock him into exclusive contracts that would have given them control over his performances, his recordings, even his public appearances. Louis always refused. He worked with managers and agents he trusted, but he never signed away his autonomy. And now, in 1954, that principle was being tested again. But this time, the stakes were higher than ever. After that meeting in Chicago, Louis returned to New York. He told his wife, Lucille, about the offer. Lucille was practical and protective. "Louis, these people, they're not regular businessmen. If you say no, there could be consequences." Louis nodded. "I know. But Lucille, if I say yes, there'll be worse consequences. I'll lose myself." Lucille understood. She had been with Louis for 12 years by then, had watched him navigate the complicated racial politics of America, had seen him maintain his dignity when others tried to strip it away. She knew that for Louis, music wasn't just a career, it was his identity, his purpose, his declaration to the world that he mattered, that he was free, that nobody could put him in a cage. Over the next 2 weeks, the pressure increased. Louis started receiving calls, friendly at first. "Mr. Armstrong, have you reconsidered our offer?" Then less friendly. "Mr. Armstrong, our employer, is disappointed. He's not used to being refused." Then ominous. "Mr. Armstrong, it would be unfortunate if certain opportunities became unavailable to you." Louis didn't scare easily. He had faced down racist mobs in the South, had stood up to venue owners who tried to segregate his audiences, had spoken out against injustice when other black entertainers stayed silent. In 1957, just 3 years after this incident, Louis would publicly criticize President Eisenhower for his inadequate response to the Little Rock school integration crisis, calling the government's action shameful. That statement cost Louis some fans and some bookings, but Louis didn't care. He had a voice, and he was going to use it. So when the threats came, Louis didn't back down. Instead, he made a decision that surprised everyone. He decided to go public. Not about the specific people making the offer, that would have been dangerous and legally complicated, but about the principle. In an interview with Downbeat magazine in March 1954, Louis said something that shocked the music industry. "I've had people try to buy me my whole career. They offer money, they offer security, they offer everything except the one thing that matters: respect for my art and my freedom. And I'm here to tell young musicians something important. Never let anyone own you. No amount of money is worth your soul." Here's what most people don't understand about that era. In the 1950s, organized criminal elements had significant influence in the entertainment industry, particularly in nightclubs and venues. Many musicians felt they had no choice but to cooperate with these interests if they wanted to work. Louis's public statement was seen as incredibly brave, almost recklessly so. But Louis had calculated something. He was too famous, too beloved, too internationally recognized to be easily intimidated. His fans included everyone from working-class black families to European royalty. He had performed at the White House. He was, in many ways, untouchable. Not completely, but enough that he could take risks others couldn't. And Louis understood that his fame gave him a responsibility. He wasn't just Louis Armstrong, the entertainer. He was Louis Armstrong, the symbol, the man who had risen from the battlefield neighborhood in New Orleans to play for kings, the man who proved that talent, determination, and integrity could overcome almost any obstacle. If Louis sold out now, what message would that send to the young black kids who looked up to him? What would it say to his mother's memory? This brings us back to that night in Manhattan, February 26, 1954, the confrontation that would define Louis's legacy in ways that had nothing to do with music. After Louis's Downbeat interview was published, the people behind the offer decided to make one final push. They couldn't let Louis's refusal stand. It would set a bad precedent, make them look weak. So they arranged a meeting. Louis was staying at a hotel in Manhattan. Late in the evening, there was a knock on his door. When he opened it, there stood the same representative from Chicago, but this time he wasn't smiling. "Mr. Armstrong, my employer is very disappointed with your interview. You embarrassed him. You made him look like someone who can be refused. He doesn't appreciate that." Louis looked at the man calmly. "I didn't mention any names. I didn't identify anyone. I just stated my principles." The man stepped into the room uninvited. "Nevertheless, he feels you owe him an apology, an acceptance of his offer, to smooth things over." The man reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. He handed it to Louis. "Open it." Inside was a check. Louis looked at it and felt his heart skip. The check had a signature at the bottom, but no amount was written. Just a note. "Fill in whatever number you want. No limit. This is your last chance." Louis stared at that check for a long moment. He thought about his childhood, about watching his mother struggle. He thought about the colored waif's home, about learning to play cornet with an instrument that was dented and old. He thought about all the times he had been poor, hungry, afraid. This check could erase all of that forever. He could write any number, $100,000, $500,000, $1 million. Whatever he wanted. He could secure his future, Lucille's future, never worry about money again. All he had to do was sign away his freedom. Let someone else control his schedule, his performances, his art. Become a possession, a very well-paid possession, but a possession nonetheless. Louis looked up at the man. "You know what the problem with this check is?" The man raised an eyebrow. "There's no problem. It's unlimited." Louis smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The problem is there's no number high enough to buy what you're asking for, because what you're asking for isn't for sale." The man's expression hardened. "Mr. Armstrong, you're making a mistake, a very serious mistake." Louis walked to the door and opened it. "No, I made my mistake years ago when I even considered this. Now I'm correcting it. Please leave." The man didn't move. "There will be consequences." Louis's voice was steady but firm. "I'm 52 years old. I grew up in the most dangerous neighborhood in New Orleans. I survived poverty, racism, violence, and humiliation. I've been threatened before. I've been afraid before, but I've never been owned, and I'm not starting tonight." The man stood there for another moment, then slowly walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned back. "You could have been very rich." Louis replied, "I am very rich. I have my music, my wife, my dignity, and my freedom. That's wealth you can't put a price on." After the man left, Louis sat down on the bed. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline. He had just refused what might have been the most lucrative offer of his career. He had potentially made powerful enemies, but he had done the right thing. Lucille came in from the adjoining room where she had been listening. She sat next to Louis and took his hand. "Are you okay?" Louis nodded. "I'm more than okay. For the first time in weeks, I feel free." Lucille smiled. "You know, when I married you, I knew I was marrying a stubborn man, but I didn't know I was marrying a hero." Louis laughed. "I'm not a hero, Lucille. I'm just a trumpet player who knows the difference between a paycheck and a prison sentence." The next morning, Louis did something that surprised everyone. He called a press conference. Journalists from the major New York papers showed up, expecting an announcement about a new album or tour. Instead, Louis made a statement that would echo through the music industry for decades. "I want to talk to young musicians today. Young people who are just starting out, who are hungry, who want to make it in this business. You're going to be offered things, money, fame, security. And some of those offers are going to come with strings attached, strings that will tie you up and never let you go. I'm here to tell you, don't take those offers. I don't care how much money they're offering. I don't care how scared you are about your future. Your freedom is worth more than any amount of money. Your art is worth more than any contract, and your dignity is worth more than any security." Louis paused, looking directly at the cameras. "Last night, someone offered me a blank check, literally. A check where I could write any amount I wanted, and I turned it down. Not because I don't like money, not because I'm financially comfortable, though I am, but because the price for that check was too high. They wanted me to perform exclusively for them, to give them control over my schedule, my performances, my art, to become their property. And I will never be anyone's property." The room erupted with questions. Reporters shouted over each other. Who made this offer? How much money are we talking about? What are the consequences of refusing? Louis raised his hand for silence. "I'm not going to name names. That's not the point. The point is the principle. In this country, we fought a war to end one kind of slavery. But there are other kinds of slavery, economic slavery, the slavery of debt and desperation. The slavery that makes you compromise everything you believe in just to survive. And I'm saying to young people, don't accept that slavery. Find another way, even if it's harder, even if it takes longer. Keep your freedom." One reporter asked, "Mr. Armstrong, aren't you afraid of retaliation?" Louis looked at him. "I've been afraid before. Fear is nothing new to me. But I'd rather be afraid and free than safe and owned." If you're inspired by Louis's courage and want to hear more stories about artists who stood up for their principles, please hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. They remind us that integrity isn't just a word, it's a choice we make every single day. The consequences of Louis's refusal were immediate and complicated. Within a week, several venue bookings mysteriously canceled. Promoters who had been enthusiastic suddenly became unavailable. Louis found himself shut out of certain clubs and certain cities, but something else happened too. Other musicians started coming forward with their own stories. They had been pressured, controlled, exploited, but they had been too afraid to speak up. Louis's public stand gave them courage. Within months, there was a movement in the jazz community to push back against exploitative contracts and shady business practices. Musicians started demanding better terms, more control over their work, fair compensation. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a shift, and Louis was at the center of it. More importantly, something happened with the young musicians Louis had addressed in his press conference. Letters started arriving, hundreds of them, from young trumpet players, saxophonists, singers, all saying the same thing. "Thank you for showing us that success doesn't mean selling out. Thank you for proving that integrity matters more than money." One letter came from a 16-year-old trumpet player in New Orleans named Winton. The letter said, "Mr. Armstrong, I read about what you did. I'm a young musician and I'm struggling. My family needs money. I've been offered opportunities that don't feel right. But after hearing your story, I'm going to wait. I'm going to find the right opportunities. Thank you for being an example." Louis kept that letter for the rest of his life. Years later, when people asked him about the blank check incident, Louis would say, "That wasn't about me. That was about every kid who's ever been told they have to compromise their dreams to survive. I wanted them to know there's another way. But the most profound consequence came from an unexpected source. 6 months after the Manhattan confrontation, Louis received a visit from a young man. The young man introduced himself as Michael, and he said something that shocked Louis. "Mr. Armstrong, I work for the people who offered you that check. I'm low level, just an assistant, but I heard what you did. I heard how you refused, and I want you to know it changed my life." Louis invited Michael in. "How did it change your life?" Michael sat down, nervous but determined to speak. "I grew up poor, like you. I thought the only way to escape poverty was to work for powerful people, do whatever they said, compromise whatever I had to compromise. But when I heard you turned down unlimited money to keep your freedom, I realized I was wrong. I've been living in a prison of my own making. Last week, I quit my job. I'm going back to school. I'm going to find a legitimate career. A career I can be proud of, the word swim." Louis looked at this young man and saw himself 50 years earlier. A kid from a poor neighborhood trying to find his way in a complicated world. "What are you going to study?" Michael smiled. "Music, education. I want to teach kids like us that they don't have to compromise who they are to succeed." Louis Armstrong died on July 6, 1971, 17 years after refusing that blank check. He died in his home in Corona, Queens, surrounded by love and dignity. In his obituary, the New York Times called him the most important musician in jazz history. But Louis's legacy extended far beyond music. He had shown that a person could rise from the poorest circumstances, achieve global fame, and still maintain their integrity. That you could be successful without being owned. That freedom was worth more than any amount of money. At his funeral, thousands gathered, the musicians, fans, dignitaries. But one person in attendance stood out. A 40-year-old man named Michael, now a music professor at a community college in the Bronx, teaching kids from poor neighborhoods that they could use music to change their lives. He stood quietly in the back, tears streaming down his face, holding a photograph. The photograph showed him at age 20, shaking hands with Louis Armstrong. On the back, Louis had written, "To Michael, keep your freedom, keep your integrity. That's the real wealth, your friend Louis." The blank check that Louis refused was never cashed, obviously, but rumor has it that the person who offered it kept the check as a reminder that some things truly cannot be bought, that some people truly cannot be owned, that integrity, when it's real, is more powerful than any amount of money. In interviews years later, musicians who knew Louis would tell a story. They said that whenever young musicians came to Louis for advice, he would tell them the story of the blank check, and he would always end with the same words. "They offered me unlimited money, but I already had unlimited wealth. I had my music, my freedom, and my dignity, and those three things are worth more than all the money in the world." Today, the Louis Armstrong House Museum in Corona, Queens contains thousands of artifacts from Louis's life. Trumpets, letters, photographs, recordings. But there's one item that's not there, a blank check, because Louis never kept it. He tore it up that night in Manhattan and threw it away. But the memory of that check and Louis's refusal to fill it in has become one of the most powerful stories in music history. A story about a man who understood that the most expensive thing you can buy is something that should never be for sale. Your soul. February 26th, 1954. A hotel room in Manhattan, a blank check, one word, no, and a legacy that will last forever. Because Louis Armstrong taught us that being rich isn't about how much money you have, it's about how much of yourself you've managed to keep. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that integrity matters more than wealth, that freedom is worth fighting for, that one person's courage can inspire thousands, please share this video. Let others know that heroes aren't just in movies. They're real people who make real choices in real moments. And sometimes, the most heroic thing you can do is refuse what everyone else would accept. Louis Armstrong refused a blank check, and in doing so, he wrote a check that can never be cashed. A check on the infinite value of human dignity.